In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front reached a moment of critical tension. After the devastating winter of 1942-43, during which the German Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed at Stalingrad, the balance of initiative had begun to shift toward the Soviet Union, yet the front lines still stretched from the Arctic to the Black Sea, and Germany remained determined to regain the strategic momentum. Both sides prepared for what would become one of the largest and most decisive confrontations of the war. At its center stood a salient around the city of Kursk, a bulge in the front line, approximately 250 kilometers wide and 160 kilometers deep. This salient emerged after the Soviet winter offensives of February and March 1943, when the Red Army advanced westward but was halted by counterattacks from Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's forces during the Third Battle of Kharkov. By March, the front stabilized with the Kursk salient protruding into German-held territory. To German planners, this position offered both an opportunity and a challenge. It was a vulnerable bulge that could be cut off by simultaneous attacks from north and south, but it was also heavily fortified and defended by large Soviet forces. The geopolitical context in which Operation Zitadelle was conceived reflected the wider struggle between two coalitions. Germany's resources were stretched across multiple theaters. Fighting continued in North Africa, where Axis troops faced defeat, while Allied bombing intensified against German industry. Within the Axis, Romania and Hungary contributed divisions to the Eastern Front, but the burden remained overwhelmingly German. For the Soviet Union, the war had become one of survival and liberation. By mid-1943, the Red Army had grown enormously in manpower and equipment, drawing upon the vast industrial capacity relocated east of the Urals. Lend-Lease supplies from the United States and Britain also bolstered logistics, particularly with trucks, fuel, and communications equipment. The morale of the two sides also diverged. German forces remained disciplined and tactically formidable, but the loss at Stalingrad had shaken confidence. Commanders debated whether the Wehrmacht still retained the capacity for decisive offensives. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Kursk represented not only a military objective, but also a political one, to hold firm against the next German assault and, if possible, launch a counter-offensive that could drive the enemy further west. Intelligence and estimates played a significant role in shaping the preconditions for Zitadelle. German military intelligence, the Fremde Heere Ost, assessed that Soviet forces had suffered heavy losses and required time to rebuild, presenting an opportunity for a concentrated attack. Hitler, influenced by both political and military arguments, believed that a victory at Kursk would restore German prestige, stabilize the Eastern Front, and demonstrate to allies and adversaries alike that Germany remained capable of strategic offensives. On the Soviet side, intelligence provided a more accurate picture of German intentions. Through reconnaissance, partisan activity, and reports from the British, Soviet command learned of the planned German attack well in advance. Stalin, unlike in 1941, chose to listen to his generals and authorize the construction of deep defensive belts around the salient. These preparations included minefields, trenches, and anti-tank positions stretching for hundreds of kilometers, manned by fresh reserves from the steppe front, positioned behind the first lines. By the early summer of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a waiting game. Both sides built up their forces. The Germans concentrated their most modern armored formations, including Tiger and Panther tanks, while the Soviets massed artillery and reserves in unprecedented numbers. Public sentiment across both nations reflected the stakes. In Germany, propaganda emphasized the coming offensive as a decisive blow, while in the Soviet Union, the defense of Kursk was portrayed as the gateway to eventual victory. Thus, the preconditions for Operation Zitadelle were set. The Kursk salient, formed by previous offensives, became the focal point of both German hopes for restored initiative and Soviet plans for a decisive defensive stand. The strategic calculations, the buildup of forces, and the expectations of soldiers and civilians alike combined to create one of the most critical junctures of the Second World War. Operation Zitadelle began on the morning of July 5, 1943, after months of anticipation and delay. The German High Command had originally planned the offensive for May, but technical and logistical concerns, most notably the delayed readiness of the new Panther tanks and Ferdinand assault guns, pushed the start date back repeatedly. This postponement gave the Soviets additional time to prepare defensive belts and mobilize reserves, setting the stage for one of the most fortified battlefields in military history. The opening phase of the offensive was marked by massive artillery bombardments. Both German and Soviet forces unleashed thousands of shells across the front. At 2:20 a.m., Soviet artillery began a preemptive barrage based on intelligence of the impending attack, striking German assembly areas. The Germans responded hours later with their own concentrated fire, targeting Soviet forward positions in an attempt to soften defenses before the armored thrusts began. From the north, the German Ninth Army under General Walter Model launched its assault south of Orel toward the salient's northern face. Approximately 335,000 men and 1,000 tanks and assault guns advanced across a broad front, supported by artillery and Luftwaffe sorties. Their immediate objective was to penetrate the first Soviet defensive belt and drive toward Kursk itself. Resistance was fierce. The Central Front, commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky, held strong defensive positions manned by around 1,000 troops, supported by more than 5,600 guns and mortars. German forces advanced only a few kilometers on the first day, slowed by minefields, anti-tank ditches, and well-positioned artillery. In the south, the German 4th Panzer Army, under General Hermann Hoth and Army Detachment Kempf, attacked northward from the Belgorod area. This force, numbering around 20,000 to 3,000 men with over 1,200 tanks and assault guns, represented the main striking power of Zitadelle. Here, the Soviets had concentrated the Voronezh front under General Nikolai Vatutin, with about 60,000 to 5,000 men and thousands of anti-tank weapons spread across multiple defensive lines. The German offensive in the south made more progress than in the north, as armored divisions, including the 2 SS Panzer Corps, spearheaded the attack. Villages and defensive strongpoints changed hands repeatedly in brutal fighting, as Soviet infantry resisted every advance. Air power played a decisive role in the opening phase. The Luftwaffe committed nearly 2,000 aircraft, including Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, FW-190 fighter bombers, and Bf-109 fighters. The Red Air Force countered with around 2,800 aircraft, deployed in depth to intercept bombing runs and protect ground forces. Air battles raged over the battlefield, with both sides claiming heavy losses inflicted on the other. While German aircraft inflicted severe damage on Soviet armor and artillery, the Red Air Force maintained sufficient numbers to contest the skies, preventing Germany from gaining absolute air superiority. The opening days also revealed the challenges of new equipment. German Panther tanks, deployed in large numbers for the first time, suffered from mechanical breakdowns. Out of 200 Panthers committed on the southern front, nearly half were immobilized within the first days due to engine fires, transmission failures, or damage from mines. The Ferdinand assault guns, heavily armored and armed with powerful 88mm guns, proved effective at destroying Soviet tanks at long range, but were vulnerable to infantry armed with mines or Molotov cocktails due to their lack of secondary armament. For Soviet troops, the opening phase was a test of endurance. Units manned extensive trench systems, often under continuous bombardment and tank assaults. Anti-tank riflemen, mine-laying teams, and artillery crews fought to delay German advances, inflicting heavy losses but at high cost. Civilians in nearby villages were caught in the fighting, many forced to flee or take shelter as towns were reduced to rubble. Soviet command prioritized the survival of reserves, ordering withdrawals from forward positions when necessary to preserve manpower for later counterattacks. By July 7th, the pattern of battle was clear. In the north, Model's Ninth Army had made only limited progress, failing to achieve a breakthrough. In the south, Hoth's armored spearheads advanced deeper, but faced escalating resistance. The first engagements had already inflicted tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, with hundreds of tanks destroyed or disabled. Neither side had yet achieved its strategic goal, but the intensity of fighting signaled that the Battle of Kursk would be fought on a scale exceeding anything seen before on the Eastern Front. The strategic goals behind Operation Zitadelle were shaped by contrasting visions, calculations, and constraints on both the German and Soviet sides. For Adolf Hitler and the German High Command, the central aim was to restore the initiative on the Eastern Front. After the defeat at Stalingrad and the costly winter retreat of 1942-43, German prestige had been severely damaged. Hitler viewed a decisive victory at Kursk as essential for demonstrating that the Wehrmacht still retained the capacity to deliver strategic offensives. The destruction of Soviet forces within the salient would shorten the front line, stabilize the central sector, and potentially free divisions for other theaters. Operationally, the plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. The Kursk salient projected westward into German-held territory, forming a vulnerable bulge. By striking simultaneously from north and south, German forces sought to encircle and annihilate Soviet armies positioned within. The northern pincer, led by General Walter Model's 9th Army, was to advance from Orel, while the southern pincer, commanded by General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and General Werner Kempf's Army Detachment, would drive northward from Belgorod. Once both thrusts linked near Kursk, large portions of the Red Army would be encircled and destroyed. Hitler hoped that such a victory would alter the strategic situation not only in the east, but also in the wider war, reassuring allies and deterring adversaries. Logistics played a crucial role in shaping German preparations. The offensive amassed some of the most modern weapons available to the Wehrmacht. Around 2,700 tanks and assault guns were concentrated, including approximately 146 Tigers, 200 Panthers, and 90 Ferdinands. These vehicles promised superior firepower and armor compared to the Soviet T-34s and KV-1s. The Luftwaffe concentrated nearly 2,000 aircraft to support the attack. However, this buildup strained supply lines. Fuel and ammunition had to be transported over long distances on overstretched rail networks, vulnerable to Soviet partisan attacks. Mechanical reliability was also a concern. The Panther and Ferdinand were new designs with limited combat experience, and their deployment in large numbers carried inherent risks. For the Soviets, the strategic objective was fundamentally defensive at first, but with a clear plan for transitioning to the offensive. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, were fully aware of German intentions. Intelligence reports from multiple sources, including partisan activity and intercepted communications, confirmed that an offensive against Kursk was imminent. Unlike in 1941, when Stalin had dismissed warnings of invasion, by 1943 he accepted his general's advice to prepare layered defenses. The Soviet goal was not only to repel the German assault, but also to exhaust German striking power and then counterattack decisively. The depth of Soviet preparations was unprecedented. Under Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, engineers and soldiers constructed defensive belts up to 300 kilometers deep. These included more than 5,000 anti-tank mines, 4,000 anti-personnel mines, tens of thousands of trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions. The Central Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky defended the northern sector of the salient with around 71,000 men, 1,900 tanks, and 2,000 guns and mortars. The Voronezh Front under General Nikolai Vatutin guarded the southern sector with about 65,000 men and 1,700 tanks. Behind them, the Steppe Front under General Ivan Konev acted as a strategic reserve, ready to be committed once the German offensive was blunted. In total, over 1.9 million Soviet troops and 5,000 tanks were concentrated in and around the salient, making Kursk one of the most heavily defended positions in history. Propaganda also played a role in shaping expectations. German media portrayed Zitadelle as a decisive strike that would crush the Soviet colossus. Soldiers were told that their new tanks would guarantee superiority on the battlefield. Among German officers, however, skepticism grew. Field Marshal Manstein advocated for a more flexible operational concept, arguing for mobile defense and counterblows rather than a set-piece offensive against strong Soviet defenses. General Heinz Guderian, overseeing tank production, warned that committing the new Panther tanks prematurely would risk exposing their flaws. Hitler vacillated between delaying to ensure readiness and attacking before Soviet strength grew further, reflecting the tension between political imperatives and military caution. On the Soviet side, propaganda emphasized determination and resilience. Newspapers and radio broadcasts spoke of Kursk as a fortress of steel that would stop the invaders. Civilians were mobilized alongside soldiers to dig trenches and lay mines. The Red Army's emphasis on defense marked a shift from earlier periods in the war, when political considerations often forced premature offensives. Stalin's willingness to allow Zhukov and others to implement a defensive strategy indicated a maturing Soviet command structure that integrated lessons from earlier failures. Misjudgments were present on both sides. The Germans underestimated the depth and scale of Soviet defenses, expecting to achieve breakthroughs within days. They also assumed that Soviet reserves would be limited after the winter campaigns. The Soviets, while confident in their defenses, faced uncertainty about whether they could absorb the full weight of German armored formations. The Red Army had grown in strength, but the psychological impact of facing Tigers and new German technology was a serious concern among frontline troops. By early July 1943, both armies had concentrated immense forces on the Kursk front. For the Germans, Zitadelle represented the last major attempt to seize the strategic initiative in the east. For the Soviets, it was an opportunity to test their new doctrine of deep defense, followed by counteroffensive. The stage was set for a battle in which strategic goals, logistical preparations, and competing doctrines would collide on a scale unmatched in the war to that point. On July 5, 1943, the long-anticipated clash at Kursk began in earnest. After months of preparation, German armored spearheads advanced into the dense network of Soviet defenses. What unfolded over the first days was a series of grinding battles, where technological advantages, tactical doctrines, and human endurance were tested under conditions of unprecedented intensity. In the northern sector, General Walter Model's Ninth Army launched its attack southward from the Ural region. Facing him was General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front, deeply entrenched in successive defensive belts. German forces, numbering about 35,000 men and 1,000 tanks and assault guns, moved against Soviet positions manned by roughly 71,000 troops with nearly twice the artillery. The initial German advances quickly encountered minefields. Soviet engineers had laid more than 2,000 mines in this sector alone. Pioneer units worked under fire to clear paths, while Soviet artillery rained shells on advancing columns. German progress was measured in kilometers rather than breakthroughs. By July 7th, despite repeated assaults, Ninth Army had advanced no more than 10 kilometers, suffering heavy losses for limited gains. The southern sector saw a more dramatic movement. Here, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and General Werner Kempf's army detachment pressed northward from Belgorod toward the Kursk salient. The main striking force was the 2 SS Panzer Corps, comprising 3 elite divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. Equipped with Tigers, Panthers, and a large concentration of Panzer IV, these divisions spearheaded the attack against General Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh front. Initial progress was greater than in the north. By July 7th, German spearheads had penetrated up to 25 kilometers, capturing several villages and breaching multiple defensive belts. The battles around the southern approaches were marked by intense tank engagements. Villages such as Bykovka and Yakovlevo became focal points, changing hands multiple times in a single day. Soviet defenders employed a layered defense, allowing forward units to fight delaying actions before retreating to new positions. Anti-tank strongpoints, often manned by infantry armed with 45mm and 76.2mm guns, exacted a toll on German armor. Mines accounted for a significant proportion of losses. German records indicate that up to 40% of tank casualties in the first days were caused by mines rather than direct combat. Air operations intensified the struggle. The Luftwaffe committed more than 1,800 aircraft on the opening day, including waves of Ju-87 dive bombers striking Soviet positions and tank concentrations. The Red Air Force, deploying around 2,800 aircraft, responded with massed fighter patrols and ground attack sorties. Dogfights erupted continuously over the battlefield. Neither side achieved complete air superiority, but Soviet aircraft, supported by radar-directed control from the ground, were able to blunt the impact of German bombing. German armored formations often advanced under the roar of their own air cover, only to be struck by Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes operating in coordinated waves. For the soldiers on the ground, the first engagements were chaotic and punishing. German tank crews faced hidden anti-tank guns that struck from unexpected angles. Soviet infantry endured bombardments before counterattacking in close combat, sometimes resorting to grenades and Molotov cocktails against tanks. Civilians caught in the frontline villages fled wherever possible. Many were evacuated by Soviet authorities before the offensive, but others were trapped in the crossfire, seeking shelter in cellars or makeshift dugouts as their homes were destroyed. The introduction of new German vehicles shaped the first clashes but revealed limitations. The Panther tank, deployed in large numbers with the Großdeutschland Division, showed its superior gun and armor in combat, capable of destroying T-34s at long range. Yet mechanical breakdowns reduced operational numbers dramatically. By July 6th, fewer than half remained serviceable. The Ferdinand assault gun demonstrated its killing power against Soviet armor, claiming hundreds of tank kills, but its lack of secondary weapons made it vulnerable to infantry assaults and built-up terrain. These limitations forced German commanders to adapt tactics quickly, often relying more heavily on Panzer IVs, which proved the most reliable vehicle in the offensive. Soviet defensive doctrine emphasized resilience over immediate victory. Rokossovsky and Vatutin ordered their commanders to hold successive lines and inflict maximum attrition, even if this meant ceding ground. This approach preserved strength for counterattacks. Behind the first belts, Soviet reserves waited to be committed at decisive moments. Stalin himself, though closely monitoring developments, refrained from prematurely ordering large-scale counteroffensives, following Zhukov's advice to let the Germans exhaust themselves first. By July 9th, it was clear that the battle was escalating into a contest of attrition. German forces in the south continued to press forward toward the town of Prokhorovka, seeking a breakthrough that could split Soviet defenses. In the north, Model's Ninth Army remained stalled, unable to penetrate Rokossovsky's deeply layered defenses. Both sides had suffered severe casualties. German tank losses numbered in the hundreds, while Soviet losses in men and equipment were even greater, but offset by deeper reserves. Morale remained high on both sides, fueled by propaganda that depicted the fighting as decisive for the outcome of the war. The first engagements of Operation Zitadelle thus set the tone for what was to follow. Neither side achieved a quick breakthrough, and the battle was transforming into a prolonged confrontation where endurance, reserves, and the ability to adapt would decide the outcome. Kursk was becoming not a swift encirclement, as German planners had envisioned, but a drawn-out struggle of men, machines, and willpower. As the second week of July 1943 unfolded, the fighting around Kursk intensified into a full crisis for both German and Soviet commands. Operation Zitadelle, intended as a rapid strike to encircle Soviet forces, had already bogged down into attritional warfare. The German spearheads were advancing, particularly in the south, but the pace was slower than anticipated, while Soviet resistance remained formidable. Reinforcements were fed into the battle on both sides, and casualties mounted at an accelerating rate. Political and military leaders in Berlin and Moscow monitored the unfolding situation closely, recognizing that the outcome would have wide-reaching consequences for the entire Eastern Front. In the northern sector, General Walter Model's Ninth Army continued its struggle against Rokossovsky's Central Front. The Soviet defenses, arranged in depth, absorbed the pressure of repeated German assaults. Each time German units cleared a minefield or destroyed a strongpoint, new defensive lines emerged behind it. Luftwaffe sorties supported the effort, but losses mounted under Soviet anti-aircraft fire and counterattacks by the Red Air Force. The German offensive in this sector stalled within a few days, having advanced only about 10 to 12 kilometers. By July 10th, it was apparent that Model would be unable to achieve a breakthrough toward Kursk. The crisis for the Germans in the north was not only the lack of progress, but also the heavy consumption of men, tanks, and fuel without strategic results. The southern sector, by contrast, remained the focus of German hopes. General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf pressed steadily northward, with the 2 SS Panzer Corps spearheading the drive. Villages such as Oktyabrski State Farm, Bykovka, and Yakovlevo became battlegrounds where entire divisions clashed. The Germans advanced up to 30 kilometers, pushing through the first 3 Soviet defensive belts. Yet this progress came at enormous cost. The Soviets countered with constant artillery fire, night raids, and localized counterattacks. Minefields inflicted further attrition, and engineers struggled to keep supply routes clear. Still, the Germans pressed onward, hoping to link their drive with the stalled northern pincer. Soviet commanders recognized the growing danger in the south. Vatutin committed reserves from the Voronezh front to slow the German advance, while General Ivan Konev's steppe front prepared to enter the battle as a decisive reserve. The Stavka also reinforced the threatened sectors with fresh tank corps, including units equipped with the latest T-34-43 models and Su-152 assault guns, whose heavy 152 mm guns proved effective even against Tigers and Ferdinands. The Red Air Force increased sorties, targeting German columns on the move and striking fuel depots. Soviet strategy emphasized absorbing German momentum and preventing a breakthrough, while holding back enough reserves for a counteroffensive. The crisis was not purely military. Political tensions shaped decisions in both capitals. In Berlin, Hitler faced pressure from his generals, who had already expressed doubts about the offensive's prospects. Field Marshal von Manstein urged that the attack continue, arguing that German forces were wearing down Soviet defenses and that a breakthrough remained possible if reserves were committed. General Heinz Guderian, overseeing armored production, warned that further losses of new tanks would cripple Germany's long-term capacity. Hitler himself vacillated, anxious over reports of an impending Allied landing in Sicily, which threatened to divert resources to the Mediterranean. In Moscow, Stalin and the Stavka followed developments hour by hour. Although Soviet losses were immense, by mid-July, some estimates indicated over 2,000 casualties and thousands of tanks destroyed or disabled. Confidence remained high. The Soviet leadership believed that German forces had failed to achieve the rapid encirclement they needed, and that every passing day tilted the balance further toward the Red Army. Stalin accepted the advice of Zhukov and Vasilevsky to wait before committing the full strength of the steppe front, trusting that the Germans were approaching exhaustion. For soldiers on the front lines, the crisis was experienced as unrelenting combat. German panzer crews described advancing through villages reduced to rubble, only to be struck by concealed anti-tank guns or swarmed by Soviet infantry. Soviet defenders endured days of bombardment, clinging to trenches and bunkers despite heavy casualties. The use of flamethrowers, close-range artillery, and low-level air attacks made the battlefield one of constant danger. Civilians trapped in contested areas continued to suffer displacement, bombardment, and requisitioning by both armies. By July 11th, the German southern spearhead approached the town of Prokhorovka, where the 2 SS Panzer Corps prepared for a decisive assault. Soviet intelligence recognized the danger and ordered the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov to move into position. This set the stage for one of the largest armored clashes of the war. The crisis of Operation Zitadelle was thus reaching its climax. The Germans sought one last push to break through the Soviet defenses, while the Soviets prepared a massive counterstroke to halt and reverse the offensive. The escalation of fighting, the immense reinforcement of both sides, and the political stakes surrounding the operation made mid-July 1943 a decisive moment. For Germany, Zitadelle had already consumed precious resources, while the hoped-for breakthrough remained elusive. For the Soviet Union, the challenge was to endure the heaviest blow yet delivered by the Wehrmacht, and emerge with the strength to strike back. The crisis at Kursk had become not just a battle of maneuver, but a struggle of attrition and will, in which the decisions of the coming days would determine the future course of the Eastern Front. By mid-July 1943, Operation Zitadelle reached its peak. The German offensive, concentrated primarily in the southern sector, culminated in the immense clash near the town of Prokhorovka on July 12th. This battle, involving thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers, represented the largest single armored engagement of the war and the high point of the German effort to break through the Soviet defenses around Kursk. The struggle at Prokhorovka, alongside simultaneous developments elsewhere, demonstrated both the scale of the German commitment and the resilience of Soviet defenses. The approach to Prokhorovka was the result of steady German gains. Over the preceding week, the 2 SS Panzer Corps had advanced through multiple defensive belts, suffering heavy losses but continuing to press forward. By July 11th, its divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, were positioned just south of Prokhorovka, having pushed Soviet forces back toward their reserve lines. The German plan was to strike through the area and seize the high ground beyond, creating the conditions for an operational breakthrough. For the Germans, this represented their last opportunity to achieve decisive results before exhaustion set in. On the Soviet side, the Stavka had already anticipated Prokhorovka as a critical point. General Vatutin ordered the commitment of the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov, which had been held in reserve for exactly such a moment. The 5th Guards Tank Army, numbering around 850 tanks and self-propelled guns, including large numbers of T-34s and lighter T-70s, was tasked with halting the SS divisions and preventing a German breakthrough. The decision to launch a massive counterattack directly against the advancing panzers was based on the need to stop the momentum of the German offensive at its most dangerous point. On the morning of July 12th, one of the most dramatic clashes of the Eastern Front erupted. Around 6 a.m., Soviet tank brigades charged forward against the German positions. The battlefield, consisting of rolling terrain, villages, and deep ravines, compressed the fighting into a relatively narrow area. Estimates suggest that more than 1,200 tanks and assault guns were engaged over the course of the day. The Soviet tactic was to close the distance quickly, negating the long-range firepower advantage of the German Tigers and Panthers. This produced chaotic, close-quarters combat, with tanks engaging at ranges of a few hundred meters or less. The fighting at Prokhorovka was marked by confusion, density, and attrition. Soviet T-34s rushed directly into German lines, often colliding with enemy vehicles or being destroyed at point-blank range. German units, though outnumbered in the immediate sector, used their superior optics and firepower to knock out large numbers of Soviet tanks. The Leibstandarte division in particular reported destroying hundreds of enemy vehicles in defensive actions throughout the day. Soviet losses were immense. Estimates suggest up to 300-400 tanks disabled or destroyed. German losses were significantly lower, though far from negligible. The attrition in men, tanks, and fuel reduced their capacity for further offensive action. While Prokhorovka is remembered as the most visible peak of the battle, fighting raged across the entire Kursk salient at the same time. In the north, Model's 9th Army had exhausted itself against Rokossovsky's Central Front, achieving only minor penetrations. Soviet counterattacks there gradually began to push the Germans back toward their starting positions. In the south, although Hoth's 4th Panzer Army made tactical gains, the arrival of fresh Soviet reserves increasingly limited their ability to advance. The Luftwaffe and Red Air Force also reached their peak intensity during this phase. More than 3,000 sorties were flown daily by each side. The Germans relied heavily on Ju-87 dive bombers and HS-129 ground attack aircraft, while the Soviets employed waves of Il-2 Sturmovix. Air superiority remained contested, with the Luftwaffe still capable of concentrated strikes but unable to dominate the skies completely. Soviet fighter production and deployment ensured that their air forces could absorb heavy losses and continue to operate. Civilians in the Kursk region endured the worst of the battle's peak. Villages around Prokhorovka and Belgorod were caught in the fighting, destroyed by artillery and tank fire. Many inhabitants had been evacuated earlier, but thousands remained, hiding in dugouts or fleeing as the battle surged across their lands. Fields, livestock, and infrastructure were obliterated in the process, leaving behind devastation that would take years to recover from. High command decisions at this stage reflected the immense pressure on both sides. Hitler, informed of Allied landings in Sicily on July the 10th, began to waver in his commitment to Zitadelle. He summoned his generals to his headquarters and questioned whether the offensive should continue. Manstein argued that the southern pincer was still progressing and could achieve operational success if reinforced, but Hitler increasingly viewed the campaign as unsustainable. In Moscow, Stalin and his generals judged that the Germans had reached their culmination point. Orders were issued to prepare for a general Soviet counteroffensive once the German thrusts had been halted. By July 13th, the Germans had failed to achieve the breakthrough they sought at Prokhorovka. Though Soviet losses were greater, the Red Army retained the reserves and defensive depth to continue fighting. The Germans, by contrast, had expended much of their striking power. Operation Zitadelle had reached its peak in terms of intensity and commitment, but the strategic initiative was slipping away. The largest battle of tanks in history symbolized both the height of German effort on the Eastern Front and the resilience of Soviet defense. The coming days would transform this climax into a turning point that marked the irreversible shift of momentum in the war. After the climax at Prokhorovka, Operation Zitadelle entered a phase defined by resistance and adaptation. Neither side had achieved the breakthrough they desired, and the fighting shifted from concentrated thrusts to a contest of endurance, counterattacks, and improvisation. By mid-July 1943, both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army recognized that the battle was no longer about rapid encirclements, but about sustaining operations under immense pressure and adapting to a battlefield that consumed men and machines at extraordinary rates. For the Germans, resistance took the form of holding on to the hard-won territory gained in the first week of the offensive. The two SS Panzer Corps, having fought at Prokhorovka, dug in to repel Soviet counterattacks. Panzer crews employed defensive tactics, positioning Tigers and Panthers on ridgelines to exploit their superior guns, while engineers laid new minefields to slow advancing Soviet armor. Infantry divisions entrenched in villages and strong points, supported by artillery and anti-tank guns. This defensive posture represented an adaptation to the reality that further advances were unlikely, but it also highlighted the shift from offensive ambition to a struggle for survival. The Red Army, by contrast, transitioned from defense to counteroffensive. Although Soviet tank losses at Prokhorovka had been severe, the Stavka still held massive reserves. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was reorganized and resupplied, while Konev's steppe front prepared to join the battle in force. Soviet adaptation involved not only the introduction of fresh units, but also tactical changes. Commanders emphasized combined arms coordination, integrating artillery barrages, air strikes, and infantry assaults with armored thrusts. Anti-tank rifle teams, mine-laying detachments, and mobile artillery were concentrated at anticipated German axes of attack, reducing the effectiveness of German armor even when it remained technically superior. Resistance was not limited to regular armies. Soviet partisans operating behind German lines intensified their activity during Zitadelle. Rail lines supplying the German front were sabotaged repeatedly, delaying the arrival of fuel, ammunition, and replacements. German countermeasures included anti-partisan sweeps and reprisals, which strained manpower that might otherwise have been used at the front. These disruptions reflected the broader Soviet strategy of waging total war, in which local populations contributed directly to weakening German logistics. On the German side, adaptation also involved shifting resources in response to the broader war. Reports of the Allied landings in Sicily forced Hitler to reconsider priorities. Reinforcements originally earmarked for Kursk were diverted to the Mediterranean, limiting Germany's ability to sustain Zitadelle. Commanders like Manstein argued for continuing the offensive in the south, but Hitler's strategic focus was already changing. This dissonance between the operational situation at the front and the political decisions in Berlin created uncertainty among German field commanders, complicating their ability to adapt effectively. Psychological adaptation was another crucial dimension. German soldiers, who had entered the offensive expecting a decisive victory, now faced a grinding battle of attrition. Morale was sustained by unit cohesion and belief in their equipment, but the failure to break through undermined confidence. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, drew encouragement from the ability to resist Germany's strongest assault to date. Propaganda reinforced this contrast. German communiques emphasized tactical successes and tank kills, while Soviet newspapers and radio highlighted the endurance of their defenders and the exhaustion of the enemy. Innovation played an important role in this stage of the battle. German engineers refined the use of mine-clearing tanks and portable flamethrowers to break through fortified positions, though such methods achieved only local success. Soviet forces adapted by deploying new weapons such as the Su-152 Beast Killer, capable of destroying Tigers and Ferdinands with its heavy shells. Mobile repair teams worked near the front lines, returning damaged T-34s to service within hours, ensuring a steady flow of operational tanks. Both sides learned to adapt their air operations. The Luftwaffe increasingly focused on interdiction of Soviet supply routes, while the Red Air Force concentrated on low-level strikes against German armored concentrations. For civilians, resistance and adaptation took more subtle forms. In villages recaptured by Soviet forces, inhabitants assisted soldiers by guiding them through local terrain or helping to construct field fortifications. In areas still under German control, civilians adapted to constant movement of front lines by evacuating livestock, hiding food supplies, or assisting partisans in small but critical ways. The destruction of farmland and infrastructure forced many to improvise for survival, relying on makeshift shelters and communal food preparation as the battle engulfed their homes. By mid-July, the contours of the campaign had shifted decisively. German resistance slowed Soviet advances but could not regain the initiative. Soviet adaptation, both in terms of reinforcements and tactical innovation, ensured that the Red Army could sustain offensive pressure. What had begun as a German attempt to destroy Soviet forces had transformed into a Soviet effort to wear down and ultimately push back the Wehrmacht. The capacity to adapt under fire, reorganize forces, and maintain morale defined this stage of the battle, setting the conditions for the turning point that would soon follow. The turning point of Operation Zitadelle came in the days immediately following the clash at Prokhorovka, when the momentum of the battle shifted irreversibly away from the Germans. Although the Wehrmacht still held considerable ground in the southern sector, the offensive had culminated. The intended encirclement of Soviet forces within the Kursk salient was no longer feasible, and the strategic initiative passed to the Red Army. This transition was the product of multiple factors: the exhaustion of German armored formations, the depth of Soviet reserves, the scale of attrition, and decisions at the highest political levels. The first indication of the turning point was the inability of the Germans to resume major offensive action after July 12th. In the north, Model's Ninth Army had already been brought to a halt by Rokossovsky's layered defenses. Despite repeated attempts to renew attacks, the combination of heavy minefields, artillery barrages, and counterattacks left Ninth Army with no path forward. Losses in tanks and manpower exceeded replacements, and morale faltered as soldiers realized that weeks of effort had brought only minimal territorial gains. By July 14th, Model shifted his forces to defensive positions, effectively ending offensive operations in the northern sector. In the south, the Manstein still believed that further progress might be possible. The 2 SS Panzer Corps, though reduced in strength, remained an effective fighting formation. German reports claimed high numbers of Soviet tanks destroyed during Prokhorovka, and commanders argued that the Red Army was close to collapse. Yet the reality was different. While Soviet losses were indeed heavy, the Stavka had kept fresh armies in reserve. On July 12th, as the Germans stalled at Prokhorovka, the Soviets launched counteroffensives outside the salient. The Bryansk front attacked toward Orel in Operation Kutuzov, threatening the northern flank of Army Group Center. This forced German commanders to divert units away from Kursk, weakening the already strained offensive. The political dimension of the turning point was decisive. On July 13th, Hitler convened his generals at his headquarters in East Prussia. Reports of the Allied invasion of Sicily on July 10th had convinced him that Germany faced new dangers in the Mediterranean. Concerned about Italy's stability and the possibility of Allied operations in southern Europe, Hitler ordered a suspension of Zitadelle. Manstein protested, arguing that one more push in the south could achieve a breakthrough, but Hitler insisted that reserves be transferred to other theaters. The decision marked the formal end of Germany's last large-scale strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, the turning point was recognized and seized upon. Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky had long anticipated that once the German offensive was blunted, the Red Army could move to the counter-offensive. On July 12th, Operation Kutuzov began against the Oral salient, involving over 1 million Soviet troops and more than 2,000 tanks. German forces, already committed at Kursk, struggled to contain the assault. Within weeks, the Oral salient collapsed, forcing a withdrawal that eliminated any possibility of resuming Zitadelle. In the south, preparations began for Operation Rumyantsev, a counter-offensive aimed at Belgorod and Kharkov, which would soon exploit the weakened state of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. The human dimension of the turning point was evident on the battlefield. German tank crews, who had entered the operation with new equipment and expectations of superiority, now faced dwindling numbers, fuel shortages, and continuous Soviet attacks. Many units reported fewer than half of their tanks operational. Soviet soldiers, despite immense losses, recognized that the German advance had been halted and drew confidence from the arrival of reserves and the shift to counterattack. Propaganda in both nations reflected the moment. German communiques became more defensive in tone, while Soviet reports highlighted the halting of the fascist offensive as a sign of impending victory. Civilians also perceived the change. In villages retaken by Soviet forces, inhabitants emerged from hiding to greet soldiers, though often returning to homes destroyed in the fighting. In German-occupied areas still contested, civilians endured reprisals as partisans increased activity. The turning point meant that the front was now moving westward again, slowly pushing German forces away from Soviet territory. For many, this shift marked the first sign that liberation was possible after 2 years of occupation. The repercussions of this turning point extended beyond the battlefield. Strategically, Germany lost the ability to launch major offensives in the east. The destruction of large numbers of tanks, the attrition of elite divisions, and the diversion of reserves to other theaters ensured that the Wehrmacht would remain on the defensive for the rest of the war. For the Soviet Union, the success at Kursk demonstrated the effectiveness of their new defensive doctrines and the growing maturity of their high command. It also provided the confidence to transition fully to large-scale offensive operations that would, within a year, carry the Red Army to the gates of Poland. Thus, the turning point of Operation Zitadelle was not defined by a single battle alone, but by the convergence of exhaustion, counter-offensives, and strategic choices. The halt of the German advance at Kursk, the Soviet counterattacks at Orel, and Hitler's decision to suspend the offensive together ensured that the initiative had passed irreversibly to the Soviet side. The largest armored battle in history ended not with a dramatic encirclement, but with a grinding halt and a decisive strategic shift that shaped the remainder of the war on the Eastern Front. By the end of July 1943, Operation Zitadelle had collapsed, and the front around Kursk was transformed from a battlefield of German initiative into a theater of Soviet counter-offensives. The aftermath was marked by retreat, attrition, and the destruction of German hopes for regaining the strategic initiative in the east. For the Red Army, the conclusion of Zitadelle opened the way for successive operations that pushed the front line steadily westward, while for the Wehrmacht, it marked the beginning of a defensive war that would continue without reprieve until 1945. The immediate military aftermath began with Operation Kutuzov in the north. Launched on July 12th, even before the German offensive was formally suspended, this Soviet operation targeted the Oral salient held by Model's 9th Army and other elements of Army Group Center. With over 1.2 million men, 2,400 tanks, and thousands of aircraft, the Soviet assault overwhelmed German defenders already weakened by Zitadelle. By early August, the Orel salient was abandoned, and German forces withdrew to a new line further west. This retreat eliminated any chance of resuming offensive action in the central sector. The withdrawal was costly. Estimates suggest that German casualties in the Orel sector exceeded 86,000 men, while the Soviets suffered nearly 43,000 casualties in their drive to recapture the region. In the south, the Soviets prepared Operation Rumyantsev, launched on August 3rd against Belgorod and Kharkov. Vatutin's Voronezh Front and Konev's Steppe Front, with nearly 1 million men and 2,400 tanks, pressed against Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Kempf's army detachment. The German 2 SS Panzer Corps, which had borne the brunt of Zitadelle, was once again called upon to resist. Despite fierce counterattacks, the Germans were unable to hold. Belgorod fell on August 5th, and Kharkov was abandoned by August 23rd after days of heavy fighting. German casualties in the southern sector were estimated at over 5,000, while the Red Army lost more than 25,000 men in the operation. These Soviet counteroffensives marked the first time that the Red Army had seized the initiative on such a wide scale and retained it without interruption. Unlike earlier offensives, which often culminated due to logistical strain or German counterblows, the campaigns following Kursk demonstrated that Soviet planning, reserves, and logistics could sustain prolonged operations. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, found itself unable to mount large-scale counteroffensives. Elite formations, including the SS divisions and the Grossdeutschland division, had been depleted and could not be rebuilt to their former strength. For civilians, the withdrawal of German forces brought mixed consequences. In areas liberated by the Red Army, inhabitants emerged from shelters to find their villages devastated by artillery and tank battles. Many homes were destroyed, crops burned, and livestock lost. Reconstruction began immediately with local populations and soldiers working together to restore roads, bridges, and basic services. However, the aftermath also revealed the scars of occupation. Reports of reprisals, forced labor, and executions surfaced as Soviet authorities re-established control. In areas still under German occupation further west, civilians now faced intensified requisitions and reprisals as German commanders sought to sustain their retreating forces. The humanitarian consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Prisoners of war captured during Zitadelle, and the counteroffensives numbered in the tens of thousands. And many German soldiers fell into Soviet captivity, where conditions were harsh and survival rates low. Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans during the fighting often faced summary execution or transport to camps with equally grim prospects. The massive movement of troops and civilians disrupted entire regions, producing refugee flows toward both Soviet-controlled and German-occupied areas. Politically, the aftermath of Zitadelle reshaped the strategic landscape. In Berlin, the failure of the offensive reinforced doubts about Germany's capacity to win the war. Hitler's decision to call off Zitadelle in order to address the crisis in Italy revealed the growing strain of a multi-front conflict. In Moscow, by contrast, the victory at Kursk and the subsequent offensives were celebrated as proof of the Red Army's ascendancy. Soviet propaganda emphasized the shift in momentum, portraying Kursk as the decisive moment when the German invader was permanently driven onto the defensive. At the operational level, the retreat forced German commanders to rethink their defensive strategy. Manstein proposed conducting flexible withdrawals to shorten the front and preserve mobility, but Hitler's insistence on holding fortress cities and refusing to yield ground limited the Wehrmacht's ability to adapt. This rigidity resulted in further losses as Soviet offensives continued into late 1943, pushing through the Dnieper Line and liberating much of Ukraine. The aftermath of Zitadelle was also felt in the composition of forces. The German armored divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, emerged from Kursk depleted. The loss of hundreds of tanks, especially the mechanical failures of the new Panthers and Ferdinands, demonstrated that technological superiority could not compensate for attrition and logistics. The Luftwaffe, which had deployed thousands of sorties during Zitadelle, also suffered losses in aircraft and experienced crews that could not easily be replaced. The Red Army, though suffering heavier casualties overall, retained the ability to replenish its ranks and equipment at a pace Germany could no longer match. By September 1943, the Eastern Front had been transformed. The Germans had lost not only the ground gained in the Kursk offensive, but also much of the territory seized in the earlier campaigns of 1941 and 1942. The Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers westward, retaking Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkov, and stood poised to continue toward the Dnieper River. The immediate aftermath of Zitadelle was therefore not simply the end of an offensive, but the beginning of a continuous Soviet advance that would not stop until Berlin itself was reached. Operation Zitadelle ended in retreat, exhaustion, and irreversible strategic loss for Germany. For the Soviet Union, the aftermath marked the transformation from defensive resilience to sustained offensive action. The consequences for both armies and for the civilian populations caught in the path of the fighting would shape the remainder of the war and ensure that Kursk remained remembered as the last major German offensive in the east. The legacy of Operation Zitadelle and the Battle of Kursk extends far beyond the summer of 1943. It was not merely another clash on the Eastern Front, but a pivotal turning point that reshaped the strategic trajectory of the Second World War. The operation marked the last major German offensive in the East, after which the Wehrmacht was forced into a permanent defensive posture. For the Soviet Union, Kursk validated years of adaptation and sacrifice, proving that the Red Army could not only withstand Germany's best efforts, but also launch counteroffensives of increasing scale and effectiveness. From a military standpoint, Zitadelle demonstrated the limits of Germany's war-making capacity. Despite concentrating some of its most advanced technology, Panther and Tiger tanks, Ferdinand assault guns, and massive Luftwaffe support, the Wehrmacht could not overcome Soviet defenses. The failure was not simply tactical, but structural. German industry, though still formidable, could no longer replace losses at the speed required to sustain major offensives. The mechanical unreliability of new weapons underscored the risks of over-reliance on advanced designs, introduced prematurely into combat. The Red Army, though suffering heavier absolute losses, possessed the industrial depth and manpower reserves to absorb such attrition. Kursk highlighted this asymmetry, which became more pronounced as the war progressed. Politically, the battle reinforced the divergent trajectories of the two warring powers. In Berlin, Hitler's prestige suffered another blow. The inability to achieve a decisive victory after Stalingrad deepened doubts among German allies and within the Wehrmacht leadership itself. The necessity of diverting forces to Italy immediately after Kursk exposed the strain of fighting a multi-front war. For the Axis, the failure at Kursk confirmed that Germany could no longer dictate the tempo of operations in the east. In Moscow, Stalin and the Soviet leadership celebrated Kursk as the decisive moment of reversal. The success bolstered Soviet confidence in their command structure, particularly in generals such as Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, Vatutin, and Konev. It also strengthened the Soviet Union's standing within the Allied coalition, demonstrating to Britain and the United States that the Red Army was capable of sustained offensives on a scale that decisively influenced the global balance of the war. The cultural and social legacies of Kursk were equally significant. For the Soviet Union, the victory became a central part of wartime memory, portrayed as the triumph of collective endurance and industrial might over an adversary that had once appeared invincible. Veterans of the battle were honored, and anniversaries of the victory were commemorated throughout the Soviet period. Kursk was used as a symbol of the Red Army's maturity, a point when Soviet military art had finally surpassed German doctrine in planning, execution, and resilience. In Germany, by contrast, Kursk was remembered as the moment when optimism about victory in the East definitively collapsed. Memoirs of German commanders often describe the battle as the turning point after which the Wehrmacht could only fight defensive campaigns. Historians have debated the precise weight of Kursk in the broader war. Some argue that the strategic turning point had already occurred with Stalingrad, and that Kursk merely confirmed a shift already underway. Others contend that Kursk was decisive in its own right, because it removed forever the possibility of Germany launching another large-scale offensive in the east. What is clear is that after Kursk, the initiative on the Eastern Front remained permanently with the Soviet Union. Successive offensives from the Dnieper campaign to Operation Bagration in 1944 built upon the momentum gained in the summer of 1943. The legacy also involves the human cost. Combined casualties for both sides at Kursk are estimated at over 1.5 million men, along with thousands of tanks and aircraft destroyed. This scale of destruction reflects both the size of the forces involved and the attritional nature of the fighting. For the soldiers who fought, Kursk was remembered as a crucible of fire, tank battles at close quarters, endless artillery barrages, and hand-to-hand combat in burning villages. Civilians, too, carried memories of displacement, destruction, and the trauma of living through a battle that engulfed their homes. These human experiences formed part of the collective memory of the war long after 1945. Strategically, Kursk reshaped the balance not only on the Eastern Front, but in the wider conflict. With Germany unable to launch further offensives in the east, the Wehrmacht was gradually pushed back toward its own frontiers. The loss of territory and resources further strained the German war effort. At the same time, the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower in waiting, its armies advancing across Eastern Europe within 2 years. The outcomes of Kursk also influenced Allied strategy. The Western Allies recognized that the Red Army would bear the main burden of defeating Germany on land, which affected decisions about the timing of operations such as the Normandy landings. The historical significance of Operation Zitadelle lies not only in the military outcome, but in its symbolism. It represents the moment when German hopes of regaining the initiative on the Eastern Front ended, and when Soviet confidence in eventual victory solidified. It was a confrontation where doctrine, technology, and manpower converged on a scale never before seen, and where the capacity to adapt and sustain operations proved more decisive than any single weapon or tactic. In the long view, Kursk stands as one of the defining battles of the Second World War. It was a battle of attrition that highlighted the transformation of the Red Army from a force battered by defeats in 1941 into one capable of coordinated, large-scale operations. It was also the moment when Germany's offensive potential was exhausted, leaving it to fight a series of defensive campaigns that could delay but not prevent ultimate defeat. Operation Zitadelle was conceived as the means to destroy Soviet power in one decisive stroke. Instead, it became the symbol of Germany's strategic decline and the Soviet Union's irreversible rise. The legacy of Kursk is therefore multifaceted: military, political, cultural, and human. It remains a subject of study and debate among historians, but its essential significance is clear. The battle confirmed that the Eastern Front would decide the war in Europe, and it marked the point when the outcome of that decision became irreversible.